I betrayed Bigfoot to the federal government in 2007, and what he did when he found me again 16 years later destroyed everything I thought I knew about forgiveness, about trust, and about what it means to be human. My name is Dr. Rachel Morrison. I'm 51 years old, and I'm a wildlife geneticist who spent the last decade and a half living with a secret so heavy it crushed my marriage, my career, and very nearly my will to live. This is a story of how I met a creature that science said couldn't exist, how I made the worst decision of my life, and how that creature taught me something about grace that no human ever could. The mist hung low over the Cascade Mountains on the morning of September 3rd, 2006, wrapping itself around the Douglas firs like wet wool. I remember the smell, that thick green scent of decomposing needles and moss, so old it had witnessed centuries. I was 35 then, lean and driven, fresh off a prestigious appointment at the Pacific Northwest Biodiversity Institute. My dissertation on genetic diversity in isolated mammal populations had earned me recognition, grants, and this assignment, a 3-month field study of black bear populations in the remote backcountry of Washington state. I'd arrived at the research station 2 weeks earlier with equipment that cost more than most people's cars, and arrogance that would soon be shattered completely. That morning, I was checking camera traps along a ridge line about 8 miles from base camp. The trail wasn't marked on any map. My guide, a weathered local named Tom Whitfield, had shown it to me reluctantly, warning me about the terrain, about getting lost, about respecting what he called the deep forest. I dismissed his concerns with the casual superiority of someone who'd spent 6 years in graduate school and thought credentials meant wisdom. The cameras had been positioned to capture bear movement patterns, triggered by motion and heat signatures. I expected images of black bears, maybe a cougar if I was lucky, deer, elk, the usual suspects of Pacific Northwest megafauna. What I found instead on camera trap 17 made my hands shake. So badly, I dropped the memory card twice before I could slot it into my laptop. The timestamp read 2:47 a.m., September 1st. The image was clear despite the infrared lighting, impossibly clear. A figure stood in the frame, bipedal, massive, at least 8 feet tall with shoulders that would dwarf any NFL linebacker. It was covered in dark hair. Not fur exactly, but thick hair that caught the camera flash in a way that made it look almost burnished. The face, God, the face. A heavy brow ridge, a broad, flat nose, eyes that even in the grainy nighttime photo held something that looked disturbingly like awareness. It was looking directly at the camera, its head tilted slightly, as if considering what the strange device might be. My scientific training screamed that this had to be a hoax, someone in a costume, a digitally manipulated image. Anything but what it appeared to be, but there were details, anatomical details, that no costume could replicate. The way the muscle structure was visible beneath the hair on the arms, the proportion of the hands, the articulation of the shoulders, the depth of the chest cavity suggesting lung capacity far beyond human normal. This was either the most sophisticated fabrication in cryptozoology history, or I was looking at evidence of a species that wasn't supposed to exist. A Sasquatch, a Bigfoot, a living, breathing impossibility. I sat there on that ridge with my laptop balanced on my knees for nearly an hour, cycling through the other images on the camera. There were 6 in total, a sequence showing the creature approaching the camera, examining it, and then moving away into the forest. In the final image, just before it disappeared into the trees, it had turned back. That last image haunted me because of what I saw in those eyes, not animal curiosity, but something deeper, something that looked almost like sadness or wariness, the kind of expression you'd see on someone who'd learned through bitter experience to be cautious. I didn't tell anyone at first. For 3 days, I kept those images to myself while I wrestled with what they meant. I ran every test I could think of to detect digital manipulation. The files were clean. I checked the camera for malfunction or damage. It was operating perfectly. I even hiked back to the exact location with fresh equipment, looking for any sign that someone had been there staging photos. I found tracks, enormous tracks, 17 inches long with a stride length that would require someone over 8 feet tall. The impressions were deep, suggesting a weight of 600 to 700 pounds. Whatever had triggered that camera was real, and it was still out there. On September 6th, I made my first attempt at contact. I left an offering of the camera location: apples, smoked salmon, nuts, things that an omnivorous creature might find appealing. I repositioned the camera and added 2 more, creating a wider field of coverage. Then I hiked back to camp and waited. The waiting was excruciating. Every sound from the forest made my pulse spike. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves. I found myself lying awake in my tent, staring at the nylon ceiling, wondering what I'd do if it actually worked, if the creature came back. It came back that very night. The new images showed it approaching the offerings, examining them carefully before taking the apples and salmon. But there was something else, something that made my breath catch. After taking the food, it had left something in return. The camera showed it placing a collection of smooth river stones in a neat pile where the food had been. This wasn't just opportunistic feeding. This was reciprocity. This was social behavior. This was intelligence. Over the next 2 weeks, I established a pattern. Every 3 days, I'd hike to location and leave offerings. Every time, the creature would visit, take what I'd left, and leave something in return. Interesting rocks, perfect pine cones, once a complete bird's nest that must have taken considerable care to transport without damaging. We were communicating, after a fashion, engaging in the most basic form of social exchange. I began varying my offerings, including things that weren't food, a small mirror, a red bandana, a harmonica. The creature examined everything with what appeared to be intense curiosity. I started seeing it during the day, just glimpses at first, a massive shape moving to the trees at the edge of my vision, there and then gone before I could fully register what I'd seen. Then closer sightings, standing at the tree line watching me work, never approaching but maintaining a presence that felt almost protective. I talked to it during these moments, keeping my voice low and calm, narrating what I was doing, explaining my research even though I had no idea if it could understand. I called it Shadow because of the way it moved through the forest, a dark presence that seemed to materialize and vanish at will. The breakthrough came on September 23rd. I was at the feeding site when I heard movement behind me. I turned slowly and there it was, no more than 30 feet away, standing in full daylight. Up close, it was even more magnificent and terrifying than the photo suggested. The muscle definition was extraordinary, the posture perfectly balanced despite its massive size. But what struck me most was the face. It was watching me with eyes that were undeniably intelligent, eyes that held what I could only describe as gentle curiosity mixed with profound caution. I sat down slowly, making myself smaller, less threatening. We stayed like that for maybe 10 minutes, just looking at each other. Then it did something that changed everything. It sat down too, mirroring my posture. The message was clear. I'm not a threat either. It reached down and picked up one of the apples I'd brought, taking a deliberate bite while maintaining eye contact. An invitation, perhaps, or a demonstration of trust. I picked up an apple too and ate it. We sat there, 30 feet apart, eating apples together in the dappled sunlight filtering through the cedar canopy. That was the day I stopped being just a scientist observing a specimen and became something else, a participant in a relationship that transcended species boundaries. Over the following weeks, Shadow began allowing me closer, never touching distance. It was clear that barrier wasn't to be crossed, but close enough that I could observe details no photograph could capture. The way its hands moved with surprising delicacy despite their size, the expressive mobility of its face, the vocalizations that seemed to carry specific meanings, a low rumble that meant contentment, a sharper grunt that indicated caution, a soft hooting sound that I came to interpret as greeting. I began documenting everything. Notes, measurements taken from a distance, audio recordings, hours of video footage. The scientist in me knew this was data of incalculable value. Shadow showed tool use, employing sticks to extract insect from logs, using rocks to crack nuts. It demonstrated understanding of cause and effect, once redirecting a small stream to access fish that had been trapped in a pool. Most remarkably, it showed cultural behavior. One day it led me to a site where several large stones had been arranged in a deliberate pattern, some kind of marker or memorial perhaps. When I looked closely, I saw that other materials had been left there, old animal bones arranged with care, feathers tied together with plant fibers. This was something passed down, learned behavior, evidence of a cultural tradition. I also learned about Shadow's life through observation and inference. It was male, probably in his late 20s based on tooth, wear, and overall physical condition. He lived alone, which seemed unusual for a species that my research suggested was at least somewhat social. I found signs that others of his kind had been in the area, tracks of different sizes, scat that showed dietary variations, but Shadow himself always appeared solitary. There was something in the way he carried himself that suggested this isolation wasn't entirely by choice. Sometimes I'd catch him making vocalizations toward the deep forest, long calling sounds that would echo through the valleys. He was listening for answers that never came. By late October, I collected enough data to revolutionize primatology, evolutionary biology, and anthropology. The genetic samples I'd gathered from hair Shadow had shed, the behavioral observations, the evidence of tool use and cultural transmission, all of it added up to proof of a species that was far more than a myth. But I hadn't told anyone. Not my colleagues at the Institute, not my husband, not the field station supervisors. I told myself I was waiting until I had enough data to present an ironclad case, but the truth was more complicated. I was protecting Shadow. I'd seen what happened to rare species when they were discovered. The invasive research, the habitat destruction, the well-meaning conservation efforts that often did more harm than good. Shadow had lived here. His kind had lived here for thousands of years in secrecy. What right did I have to expose him to a world that would see him as a specimen, a curiosity, a resource to be studied and exploited? But I was also ambitious. The thought of what this discovery could mean for my career was intoxicating. This would be bigger than Jane Goodall and the chimpanzees, bigger than Jen Fossey and the gorillas. This was a completely unknown species of great ape in North America, a finding that would rewrite textbooks and cement my name in scientific history. The internal conflict was tearing me apart. Every day I spent with Shadow, my attachment to him as an individual grew stronger, but so did the weight of the secret I was keeping. The decision was taken out of my hands on November 7, 2006. I returned to base camp to find 2 federal agents waiting for me. They were from the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. They said, following up on reports of unusual activity in the area. A hiker had reported seeing something impossible on a trail 12 miles north of my research site. The description matched Shadow perfectly. They were investigating whether someone had released an illegal exotic animal, perhaps a trained gorilla or some kind of hybrid. They wanted to know if I'd seen anything during my field work. I should have lied. God, I should have lied. But they already knew something was out there, and they had the resources to find it with or without my cooperation. More importantly, and this is the part that still makes me sick with shame, they offered me something I couldn't resist. Full federal backing for my research, unlimited funding, access to facilities and technology that would make my current setup look like a child's chemistry set, protection from any legal challenges regarding endangered species protocols, and a guarantee that I would be the lead researcher on any published findings. They were offering me everything I'd ever wanted professionally, wrapped up in the rationalization that federal protection would be better for Shadow than leaving him vulnerable to uncontrolled discovery. I told myself I was making a strategic decision, that bringing in the government meant Shadow would be protected, studied respectfully, treated as the precious and unique individual he was. I told myself I could control the narrative, ensure his safety, make sure the research was conducted ethically. I was lying to myself, and on some level, I knew it even then. What I was really doing was choosing my career over my friend. I was betraying the trust of a creature who had shown me more genuine openness and vulnerability than most humans ever would. On November 14th, 2006, I led a federal capture team into the forest. There were 12 of them, specialists in handling dangerous wildlife, equipped with tranquilizer guns designed for large primates, tracking equipment, transport vehicles modified to handle a creature Shadow size. I provided them with Shadow's movement patterns, his preferred areas, the locations where he was most likely to be found. I'd given them everything they needed to find him. The plan was to tranquilize him, transport him to a secure federal facility, and begin a comprehensive research program. They assured me he wouldn't be harmed, that the facility was state-of-the-art, that I would have complete access as the lead researcher. I wanted desperately to believe them. We found Shadow at dawn on November 15th. He was at our usual meeting spot, the place where we'd shared apples that first time. He'd left me an offering, a collection of colorful autumn leaves arranged in a careful pattern. He was waiting for me. When he saw me approaching with the team, the expression on his face nearly broke me. It wasn't anger or fear, it was confusion and hurt, the look of someone who trusted and couldn't understand why that trust was being violated. He made a vocalization I'd never heard before, a low sound that carried a note of what I can only describe as pleading or questioning. I wanted to run to him, to warn him, to tell him to flee into the deep forest where they'd never find him. But I stood there frozen while the team moved into position. Shadow could have attacked. He was enormously strong, easily capable of tearing any of us apart. Instead, he just stood there looking at me, his eyes locked on mine, as if trying to understand what was happening. The first tranquilizer dart hit him in the shoulder. He flinched but didn't run. The second hit his chest. He swayed, still watching me with those intelligent, hurt eyes. The third dart made him drop to his knees. As he went down, Shadow reached out one massive hand toward me, not aggressively, not defensively, but in a gesture that was heartbreakingly human. A reaching out, a final attempt at connection with someone he thought was a friend. Then the drugs took him completely, and he collapsed onto the forest floor. The team moved in immediately, taking measurements, collecting samples, fitting him with a tracking collar. I stood apart, watching, feeling something die inside me that I didn't have words for. They transported Shadow to a facility in central Washington, a converted military research station that had been retrofitted for xenobiological research. The official classification was unknown North American hominid, with a specimen number that reduced him from an individual to a data point. I was given the access I had been promised, a fully equipped laboratory, a team of junior researchers, and clearance to conduct whatever tests and observations I deemed necessary. What I wasn't given was any real control over Shadow's treatment or conditions. The facility was designed for containment, not comfort. Shadow was kept in a reinforced cell that was technically large enough for him to move around, but was nothing like the vast forest territory he'd roamed. The walls were concrete. The floor was concrete. The only natural light came from a few high windows designed to prevent any possibility of escape. He was fed regularly, the diet carefully formulated to meet his nutritional needs, but it was institutional food, nothing like the fresh salmon and berries he'd gathered himself. I visited him every day for the first month, standing outside the observation window, watching him pace the confines of his cell. He wouldn't look at me. When I called to him using the vocalizations we developed, he would turn away, moving to the furthest corner from where I stood. The message was clear. I had broken something that couldn't be repaired. The trust we built over those months in the forest was gone, replaced by something that looked like grief. The research proceeded regardless. DNA analysis confirmed what I'd suspected. Shadow was a previously unknown species of hominid, genetically positioned somewhere between modern humans and extinct archaic humans like Neanderthals. The similarity was stunning. 98.9% genetic overlap with Homo sapiens, closer than chimpanzees. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just a great ape. This was a sister species to humanity, a parallel branch of the human family tree that had survived in isolation while Homo sapiens came to dominate the planet. Further analysis revealed even more remarkable findings. Shadow's brain structure showed development in areas associated with complex cognition, language processing, and social bonding. He had the neurological architecture for sophisticated thought and communication. The vocal anatomy was different enough from human that he couldn't produce the same range of sounds, but the cognitive capacity was there. We were looking at a non-human person, a being with the potential for abstract thought, culture, and deep emotional connections. The weight of what I'd done became unbearable. I'd taken a thinking, feeling person from his home and imprisoned him in the name of science. Every day I watched him deteriorate psychologically. He stopped eating regularly. His movements became lethargic. The brightness I'd seen in his eyes in the forest faded to a dull resignation. The facility veterinarians assured me this was normal adjustment behavior for a captive animal, but Shadow was an animal, and this wasn't normal. This was depression, trauma, the psychological breakdown of someone whose entire world had been violently torn away. By January 2007, I was barely sleeping. My marriage was fracturing under the weight of secrets I couldn't share. My husband knew something was catastrophically wrong, but I couldn't tell him what. How could I explain that I befriended a creature that wasn't supposed to exist, and then betrayed that friendship for career advancement? How could I make him understand the guilt that was eating me alive? I started drinking heavily. Anything to quiet the voice in my head that kept repeating what I'd seen in Shadow's eyes as the tranquilizer took effect. The facility administrators were pleased with the research results and ready to move to the next phase, a comprehensive study that would involve more invasive procedures, surgical implants to monitor neurological function, controlled stress tests to observe behavioral responses, reproductive viability studies, if they could locate a female of the species. When I objected, when I argued that these procedures were unethical for a being with human-level cognition, I was reminded gently but firmly that I was an employee of the project, not its director. My role was to conduct research within the parameters they established. If I was uncomfortable with that, other geneticists could be found. I was trapped in a nightmare of my own creation. I thought I could control the situation, ensure Shadow's well-being while reaping the professional benefits of the discovery. Instead, I delivered him into a system that saw him purely as a research asset, a unique specimen to be studied until every possible piece of data had been extracted. And I was complicit in every moment of it. I was the one who'd gained his trust, who'd led him believe that humans could be approached safely. I was the one who betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible. On February 3rd, 2007, I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. I couldn't freeze Shadow. The facility security was far too sophisticated for that. And even if I could get him out, where would he go? His forest home was now crawling with federal agents searching for others of his kind. But I could give him something else. I could give him a witness. Someone who would remember him not as specimen number 47/2006, but as Shadow, as the individual who'd shared apples with me in the sunlight, who'd show me that intelligence and personhood weren't uniquely human traits. I began documenting everything in a separate record, not the sanitized scientific observations that went into the official reports, but the truth about who Shadow was, how we'd met, the relationship we'd built, and the brutal reality of what was being done to him in the name of science. I wrote about the day he'd led me to that arrangement of stones, about the pattern of reciprocity in our exchanges, about the loneliness I'd sensed in him even when he was free. I wrote about the betrayal and my role in it, sparing myself nothing. I knew this record could never be published, not while Shadow was alive and the program was active, but someday someone needed to know. The last time I saw Shadow was on March 7th, 2007. I'd been informed that morning that my contract was being terminated. The facility no longer required my services. They had enough genetic material and behavioral baseline data to continue the research without me. More concerning, they noted that my interactions with the specimen seemed to be causing it distress, agitating it rather than calming it. My presence was counterproductive. I would be escorted from the facility that afternoon, and my security clearances would be revoked immediately. I went to the observation window one final time. Shadow was lying on the concrete floor in what had become his usual position, curled against a far wall, his back to the window. I called to him, using the soft hooting sound that had once meant friendship and safety. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then slowly, so slowly, he turned his head to look at me. The pain in those eyes was unbearable. It wasn't anger anymore. It was just profound sadness, a sorrow that seemed to encompass not just his own situation, but something larger, something about what humans were capable of doing to anyone who was different, anyone who was vulnerable. I pressed my hand against the reinforced glass. I wanted to tell him I was sorry, that I'd never meant for any of this to happen, that if I could undo that day in November, I would give anything for that chance. But there were no words, no gestures that could bridge the chasm I created. Shadow looked at my hand on the glass for a long moment. Then he did something that shattered what was left of my heart. He turned away and closed his eyes, a gesture of absolute dismissal. I no longer existed for him. I'd made myself into nothing through my choices. The security guard escorted me out of the facility 20 minutes later. As we drove away, I turned to look back one final time at the complex where Shadow was imprisoned. I made a promise to myself in that moment. Somehow, someday I would make this right. I had no idea how, but I owed Shadow that much. I owed him everything. The next 16 years were a slow descent into a personal hell I'd built for myself. My marriage ended 6 months after I left the facility. My husband couldn't live with the shell I'd become, the person who drank too much and woke up screaming from nightmares she wouldn't explain. I didn't fight the divorce. I deserved to be alone. My career collapsed even more dramatically. I'd violated so many confidentiality agreements and research ethics protocols that I was essentially blacklisted from academic positions. The groundbreaking research I dreamed would make my name became a classified secret I could never discuss. I took a job as a lab technician at a private testing company, work that required none of my training and even less of my attention. I tried to find out what happened to Shadow. The facility had been shut down in 2010, the official record sealed under national security classifications. Rumors circulated in the cryptozoology community about a government Sasquatch program, but nothing concrete, nothing that would tell me if Shadow was still alive, where he might be, whether he'd suffer more after I left, or had somehow found a measure of peace. The not knowing was its own special torture. I moved to a small town in Montana in 2012, as far from the Cascade Mountains as I could get while still remaining in the Pacific Northwest. I rented a cabin at the edge of nowhere, surrounded by forests that reminded me painfully of the trees where I'd first met Shadow. I told myself I was there for the solitude, for the chance to disappear into insignificance. The truth was I was punishing myself, living in an environment that would constantly remind me of what I'd lost and what I'd destroyed. The years passed slowly. I went through the motions of living without really being alive. Work, home, sleep, repeat. I stopped drinking in 2015, not because I found some path to recovery, but because I realized the alcohol was letting me forget for hours at a time, and I didn't deserve that mercy. I needed to remember. I needed to carry the weight of what I'd done every moment of every day. On March 15th, 2023, everything changed again. I was hiking in the forest near my cabin, a routine I'd established to force myself into minimal physical activity. The trail was one I'd walked hundreds of times, a simple loop that took about 2 hours. I wasn't paying much attention to my surroundings, lost in the familiar fog of regret and self-recrimination that had become my default mental state. Then I sensed something, that peculiar feeling of being watched that's hardwired into primate awareness. I looked up and my breath stopped. There, perhaps 50 yards ahead on the trail, stood a figure that was impossible and inevitable all at once. Massive, covered in dark hair now shot through with silver, shoulders still broad despite a slight stoop that suggested age or injury. Shadow. After 16 years, after everything, he was there. He was alive. My first reaction was disbelief, so profound it felt like vertigo. This couldn't be real. I'd finally broken completely, my guilt manifesting hallucinations of the creature I betrayed. But the details were too specific, too real. I could see his breath condensing in the cold mountain air. I could see how his weight shifted as he stood there, favoring his right leg slightly. I could see the scar tissue on his left shoulder, where the first tranquilizer dart had hit him all those years ago. We stood frozen, looking at each other across that distance. I waited for him to run, to vanish into forest the way he'd done when we first met. Instead, he did something completely unexpected. He sat down right there on the trail, the same gesture he'd made that first day when we'd eaten apples together. He was offering me a choice, a chance to approach or to leave. I moved toward him slowly, my hands visible and empty, trying to communicate non-threat with every movement. As I got closer, I could see the change the 16 years had wrought. The silver in his hair wasn't just age. There were patches where hair was missing entirely, evidence of injuries or illness. His face had new scars, one particularly nasty one across his right cheek. His eyes held the same intelligence I remembered, but something else too, something that looked like weariness mixed with resolve I couldn't quite interpret. I stopped about 10 feet away, the same distance we'd maintained in those early days of our friendship. My throat was so tight I could barely speak, but I managed to force out words. Shadow, I don't have any right to even say your name. I don't have any right to be near you. But I need you to know, there hasn't been a single day in 16 years that I haven't thought about what I did to you. There hasn't been a single day I haven't wished I could take it back. Shadow tilted his head, that familiar gesture of consideration. Then he made a sound, a low vocalization that I remembered meant he was listening, processing. He reached down and picked up something from the ground beside him, a small collection of smooth river stones. He looked at them for a moment, then carefully placed them between us. The same gesture he'd used to reciprocate offerings all those years ago. He was remembering, too. I felt tears streaming down my face. They let you go, or you escaped. How long have you been free? He held up his hands, fingers spread, then closed them and opened them again, repeating the gesture multiple times. Years. Multiple years. I tried to do the math, tried to understand when and how he'd gotten out of that facility. But what mattered more was the next question. Have you been here? In this area? A nod. Clear, deliberate. He'd been living in these mountains, maybe for years. And if he'd been here, he'd almost certainly known I was here too. My cabin wasn't that far away. He could have been watching me. Why? The question came out as a whisper. Why didn't you leave? Why stay anywhere near a human after what I did to you? Shadow stood up slowly, his movements showing the stiffness of age and old injuries. He gestured for me to follow, and then began walking off the trail into the deeper forest. Every instinct of self-preservation screamed at me not to follow him into isolated terrain, but I owed him more than my safety. If he wanted to lead me somewhere and leave me there to die of exposure, it was less than I deserved. I followed. We walked for perhaps 30 minutes, moving deeper into terrain that showed no signs of human passage. Shadow moved with the assurance of someone who knew every tree, every stone, every hidden path. Finally, we emerged into a small valley I'd never seen before, a sheltered area with a stream running through it and old growth trees that created a canopy overhead. And there, scattered around the valley, were signs of occupation. Carefully constructed shelters made from branches and bark, fire pits with stones arranged around them, even what looked like basic tools laid out on a flat rock. Shadow wasn't alone. As we entered the valley, other figures emerged from the shelters and the tree line. 3 of them, 2 adults and 1 younger individual, maybe a teenager by my estimation. They were smaller than Shadow, with lighter colored hair, and they watched me with expressions that mixed curiosity with clear wariness. Shadow vocalized to them, a series of sounds that was clearly communication, possibly language. One of the adults responded, a questioning sound that Shadow answered with what seemed like reassurance. He'd found others, or maybe they'd found him. Either way, Shadow wasn't alone anymore. He had family, community, the very thing I'd sensed was missing when I first met him. The younger one, bolder than the adults, moved closer to get a better look at me. Shadow made a gentle correcting sound, and the youngster retreated, but not before giving me a look of such open curiosity that it reminded me painfully of how Shadow himself had looked at me in those early days. Shadow led me to a spot near the stream and gestured for me to sit. Then he did something that made my throat close up completely. He pulled out from within the shelter a small, weathered bundle wrapped in what looked like oiled hide. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing objects I recognized with shock that felt like electricity. The red bandana I'd given him, the small mirror, even the harmonica, tarnished but intact. He'd kept them through his captivity, through his escape, through all the years after. He'd kept these small tokens of our friendship. He held them out to me, not offering them back, but showing me that he preserved them. Then he pointed at me, at the objects and at himself, making a circling gesture that seemed to encompass everything. He was telling me something about connection, about memory, about how the past couldn't be erased no matter how much we might want to change it. I understood then why he'd stayed in this area, why he'd possibly even let himself be seen by me. This wasn't about revenge or even about forgiveness. This was about witness. He needed me to see that he'd survived, that he'd built a life despite what had been done to him. He needed me to know that I hadn't destroyed him, even though I'd tried. I wrote it all down. I told him, the words spilling out in a rush. Everything about you, about us, about what they did at that facility. I kept a record because someday people need to know, not where you are, never that, but who you are, that you're a person, that you deserve the same respect and protection that any person deserves. Shadow listened, his eyes never leaving mine. When I finished, he reached out slowly, carefully, and placed one massive hand on my shoulder. The first time he'd touched me in 16 years. The gesture wasn't gentle exactly. There was too much strength in that hand for gentleness, but it was deliberate and controlled. He was choosing to make contact despite everything. Then he did something else, something I didn't understand until much later. He took my hand and placed it over his chest, right where his heart was. I could feel it beating, strong and steady. Then he took his hand and placed it over my chest, feeling my heartbeat in return. His eyes held mine with an intensity that was almost overwhelming. We stayed like that for maybe 30 seconds, long enough for me to feel the synchronization, the rhythm of 2 hearts beating in proximity, different but fundamentally the same. He was showing me that we were the same species, the same family, that the betrayal, as deep as it was, didn't erase the fundamental connection between us. He was teaching me something about forgiveness that went deeper than words, a forgiveness that didn't require forgetting or pretending the wound had never happened, but acknowledged it and chose connection anyway. This was grace, real grace, offered by someone I'd wronged in the deepest possible way. The other members of Shadow's family had been watching this interaction with varying degrees of interest and concern. Shadow vocalized them again, and the boldest one, the youngster, approached slowly. Shadow guided the young one's hand to touch mine, a 3-way connection. This youngster had probably never been this close to a human before, had likely been taught to avoid human contact at all costs. But Shadow was choosing to show that not all humans were threats. That connection was possible. He was teaching them something different than fear and hiding. We spent the rest of that afternoon in the valley. Shadow showed me around their settlement, pointing out the things they'd built, the food they gathered and stored, the places where they slept and ate and lived. It was a culture, a society, small and hidden but real and functioning. The younger one followed us around, fascinated despite their initial caution. At one point, they picked up a round stone and rolled it toward me, a game or a test. I rolled it back. We played this simple game for several minutes while Shadow watched with what I'd swear was approval. As the sun began to set, Shadow made it clear it was time for me to leave. He walked me back toward the trail, the route easier to navigate in reverse. Before we reached the point where I could find my own way, he stopped and turned to face me. He made a gesture toward the valley, then a clear negating motion. Don't tell, don't bring others. I nodded. Never. I swear to you, never. This is your home, your family. I won't take that away from you again. He studied me for a long moment, then did something unexpected. He picked up 3 stones from the trail and stacked them carefully, one on top of the other. Then he pointed at me and made a waiting gesture. He was telling me he'd meet me here again. This wasn't goodbye forever. It was something else. An opening, a possibility. He was giving me a chance to be part of his life again, on his terms, in a way that respected his autonomy and his family's safety. I wanted to ask him 1,000 questions. How had he escaped? How had he found these others? What had the years been like for him? But I understood that those weren't my questions to ask. If he wanted to share those stories, he would in his own time. What he was offering me now was more than I deserved. A sliver of trust rebuilt from the ashes of what I destroyed. Over the following months, I met Shadow at that spot on the trail every few weeks. He would appear when he chose, never on a predictable schedule. Sometimes he'd bring the young one, who I learned was named, or at least responded to, a clicking sound I struggled to reproduce. Sometimes he came alone. We developed a new form of communication, more complex than before, incorporating gestures and vocalizations and drawings in the dirt. Through this slow process, I learned pieces of his story. He'd escaped from a facility in 2009 during a transfer between buildings. The details were unclear, but involved a vehicle accident and a moment of opportunity when his restraints failed. He'd run, injured and terrified, into the wilderness surrounding the facility. For months, he'd lived on the edge of starvation, avoiding all human contact, slowly healing from his injuries. He'd been convinced he was the last of his kind, that whatever family or community he'd once had was gone. Then he'd heard a call in the deep forest, a vocalization in the language of his people. He'd followed it for days, hardly daring to hope. He'd found a small family group, refugees like himself, survivors of various encounters with humans that had scattered them from their traditional territories. They'd been wary of him at first, a stranger, potentially dangerous. But Shadow had proven himself through patience and demonstrated peaceful intent. They'd accepted him, and over the years, the group had grown slightly as other scattered individuals found their way to the valley. The young one, the curious teenager, was the first of their kind born in the valley, a sign of hope, proof that their species could still have a future if given the space and protection to exist. Shadow had taken particular role in the youngsters' education, teaching them about the forest, about survival, but also about humans. Not all the lessons were about avoidance and fear. Shadow made sure the young one understood that humans were complex, capable of both tremendous cruelty and unexpected kindness. I was part of that education, a living example of human fallibility and the possibility of change. I asked him once why he'd shown himself to me, why he'd risked re-establishing contact with someone who betrayed him so profoundly. His answer, communicated through gesture and expression, was complex. Part of it was practical. I lived near their territory, and it was better to establish some kind of control relationship than to have me accidentally stumble upon their valley in panic. Part of it was about the young one and the others. They needed to understand that while humans were dangerous, they weren't all uniformly evil. That nuance and complexity existed. But part of it, the part that devastated me most completely, was about forgiveness itself. Shadow had learned something during his years in captivity that he wanted me to understand. The hatred and fear he'd felt initially, the anger at his betrayal, it had poisoned him as much as the captivity itself. He'd carried that rage into his freedom, and it had made him harsh, untrusting even with his new family. Only when he'd begun to let go of the anger, when he'd started to forgive not for my sake, but for his own peace, had he been able to truly heal. By showing himself to me, by offering this careful, bounded relationship, he was completing his own healing. He was proving to himself that the damage I'd done hadn't permanently broken his capacity for trust. I realized I was being given an extraordinary gift, not absolution exactly, but something more valuable, witness. Shadow was letting me witness his survival, his resilience, his ability to build a life and a family despite everything. He was showing me that I hadn't destroyed him, that my worst act hadn't been the end of his story. For someone who'd spent 16 years believing she completely ruined another being's life, this was a revelation that shattered and rebuilt me at the same time. I also came to understand the full weight of responsibility this gift carried. Shadow was trusting me with the safety of his family, with the location of perhaps the last free community of his species. That trust was conditional and fragile, built on demonstrated behavior over time, not on words or promises. One mistake, one betrayal of this new trust, and I would lose him forever. More than that, I could doom his family to the same fate I condemned him to 16 years earlier. The pressure of that responsibility was crushing and absolutely necessary. I needed to feel its weight every moment. Through my visits to the trail marker, I learned more about the Valley community. There were 5 individuals in total. Shadow, 2 adult females named by sounds I approximate as Willow and Reed, an older male called Stone, and the youngster, Cricket. They had a social structure, a division of labor, protocols for decision-making that involved lengthy discussions in their vocal language. They had rituals, too, ceremonies marking the change of seasons, honoring their dead, celebrating successful hunts, or the finding of particularly abundant food sources. They were, in every meaningful sense, a culture, a people. Cricket became particularly attached to our meetings, always eager to show me new things they'd learned or found. A perfect bird's feather, an interesting rock, once a small carved figure they'd made from a piece of wood. The carving was crude but unmistakably intentional, a representation of an animal, possibly a deer. Cricket was developing art, the ability to create representations of the world, rather than just interacting with it directly. Shadow watched these interactions with what I read as cautious approval, ready to intervene if Cricket got too comfortable or revealed too much, but allowing the relationship to develop within boundaries. One day in late summer of 2023, Shadow brought something different to our meeting. It was a bundle wrapped in leaves, and when he opened it, I saw several sheets of bark with markings on them. Not random scratches, but deliberate symbols arranged in patterns. They looked like a writing system, or at least the beginnings of one. Shadow pointed to different symbols and made specific vocalizations, then acted out their meanings. A symbol that looked like a tree meant forest. A wavy line meant water. A circle with rays coming off it meant sun or day. He was showing me that his people had developed, or perhaps redeveloped, a written language. This wasn't just culture, this was literacy, the ability to record information outside of oral tradition. The implications were staggering. This suggested either that a species had maintained written communication through their long isolation, or that they'd independently redeveloped it, possibly in response to the challenges of their scattered, hidden existence. Either way, it was evidence of cognitive sophistication that put them firmly in the category of people, not animals. Shadow wanted me to learn this writing system. Over the course of several months, he taught me the symbols and their meanings. It was slow work, complicated by the fact that their language didn't map cleanly onto English or any human language I knew, but gradually I began to be able to read simple messages. Shadow left me messages on bark, or scratched in soft earth near the trail marker, instructions about when to meet next, warnings about humans hiking too close to the valley, once heartbreakingly, a message that just said friend, using a symbol we'd established for that concept. By the fall of 2023, I realized I was being integrated into their community in a limited but real way. I was a strange human who came to the trail marker, who brought offerings of food they couldn't easily obtain, fresh fruit out of season, nuts they didn't have in their territory, occasionally dried fish or other protein sources. In return, they'd leave things they had in abundance, medicinal herbs they'd found particularly useful, instructions in their written language about plants I should avoid or seek out, once a detailed bark map, showing safe trails through their territory for times when I absolutely had to pass through. I began to understand that this was what genuine coexistence could look like, not integration, not the elimination of boundaries, but a respect for those boundaries coupled with specific, limited forms of exchange and communication. Shadow and his family didn't want to join human society. They wanted to be left alone to live as they chose. But they were pragmatic enough to recognize that absolute isolation was impossible, that humans were too numerous and too intrusive. So they'd established a relationship with one human who'd proven, slowly and painfully, that she could be trusted to respect their autonomy. The question I struggled with constantly was what to do with this knowledge, this access. Every instinct of my scientific training screamed that this was data that needed to be shared, that the existence of this community, their language, their culture, their very survival needed to be documented and publicized to ensure their protection. But I'd learned the hard way that publicity didn't equal protection, that revealing their existence to the world would more likely doom them than save them. I thought about the record I had kept, the detailed documentation of Shadow's captivity, and our original relationship. It sat in a locked box in my cabin, hundreds of pages of notes and observations that could revolutionize primatology and anthropology. I'd told Shadow about it, and he'd listened carefully when I explained that I'd written it, so that someday people would know the truth about his kind. His response had been to ask, using our shared communication system, when would this truth be told? I'd answered honestly, when it's safe, when telling your story won't lead people to hunt for you, when the world is ready to know you exist without trying to capture or control you. Shadow had considered this, and then asked a more difficult question. Will that time come? I didn't have an answer. Looking at the trajectory of human civilization, at our track record with other species, and even with other groups of humans, I couldn't honestly say I believe a time would come when it would be truly safe to reveal his people's existence. As winter approached in 2023, Cricket fell ill. Shadow came to the trail marker in obvious distress, making urgent vocalizations and gestures that I eventually understood meant the young one was sick, possibly seriously. He wanted my help. The request filled me with terror. I was a medical doctor, and what I knew about treating illness in humans might not even apply to Shadow species. But I understood that Shadow was desperate, that he was setting aside his caution and his hard-learned wariness of humans because cricket's need overrode everything else. I went back to my cabin and gathered everything I could think of that might help. Antibiotics from my own medicine cabinet, fever reducers, electrolyte solutions, clean bandages, a basic first aid kit. I met Shadow at the trail marker at dusk, and he led me to the valley, moving faster than I'd ever seen him move before. When we arrived, I found Cricket lying in one of the shelters, breathing in shallow, labored gasps, their skin hot to the touch even through the thick hair that covered their body. The other members of the family watched me with expressions that ranged from desperate hope to deep suspicion. Stone, the older male, clearly didn't trust me and made his feelings known through vocalizations that needed no translation. But Willow, one of the females who I'd come to understand was Cricket's mother, overruled him. She gestured for me to approach, to help if I could. The weight of that trust, given despite everything, despite the risk, nearly broke me. I did what I could. I got fluids into Cricket, managed to bring the fever down with medication, cleaned and bandaged what looked like an infected wound on their arm that might have been the source of the illness. I stayed in the valley through the night, monitoring Cricket's condition, adjusting treatments as their responses became clear. The antibiotics seemed to help, or at least didn't harm them. By morning, Cricket was sleeping more peacefully, the labored breathing eased. Shadow sat beside me through that long night, his presence a silent testament to how far we'd come from that day in the forest when I'd led the capture team to him. He was trusting me with the most precious thing in his world, the young one who represented his people's future. At one point, in the darkest hours before dawn, he placed his hand over mine, the same gesture he'd made months earlier, heartbeat to heartbeat, person to person. Forgiveness given and received not through words, but through the simple act of being present in crisis. Cricket recovered over the following weeks. The illness had been serious, possibly would have been fatal without intervention, but the young one's resilience pulled them through. I visited several times during the recovery, bringing more medicine, checking on their progress, earning small increments of trust from the other family members. Stone remained suspicious, which I understood and actually respected. His wariness was wise. But Willow began to relax around me, even initiating communication through the written symbols, asking questions about human medicine, about what I'd given Cricket and why. As winter deepened, my visits to the valley became less frequent. Snow made the journey difficult, and Shadow made it clear they preferred minimal contact during the coldest months, when the family was most vulnerable and their food stores most limited. We maintained communication through messages left at the trail marker, simple updates and acknowledgments that both sides were well. I used the isolation to work on my record, adding everything I had learned about the Valley community, their language, their social structure, their resilience. I also used that time to wrestle with a decision that had been building for months. What was my responsibility here? Shadow had given me a gift beyond measure, the chance to witness his people's existence, to be part of their lives in a small way, to experience the honor of their trust. But With that gift came an obligation. What should I do with what I knew? The easy answer was to do nothing, to keep their secret absolutely, to take it to my grave, and let their existence remain hidden. But was that right? If something happened to this small community, if illness or accident or human encroachment wiped them out, their entire species could vanish without the world ever knowing they'd existed. I thought about all the species we'd lost through ignorance, through not knowing they were there until it was too late to save them. I thought about all the harm that had been done in the name of conservation, the violations of autonomy justified by the greater good of species preservation. There was no clear answer, no path that didn't involve risk and potential betrayal. All I could do was try to be worthy of the trust I'd been given, to let Shadow and his family's needs, not my own sense of what should happen, guide my choices. Spring came early to the Montana mountains in 2024. By late March, the snow had melted enough that I could make my way back to the valley. I found changes. Reed, the second female, had given birth over the winter. There was a new infant, tiny and helpless in a way that emphasized how human-like their developmental pattern was. Shadow showed me the newborn with obvious pride, letting me observe from a respectful distance. This baby represented something profound, proof that the species could not just survive but grow, that there was hope for a future. Cricket had grown too, not just physically but in confidence and capability. The youngster had taken on more responsibilities within the family group, helping gather food, maintaining the shelters, even beginning to teach some of what they knew to the new baby. I realized I was watching the transmission of culture across generations, the knowledge and traditions of these people being passed from old to young, ensuring continuity. It was beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. Beautiful because it was working, heartbreaking because it was so fragile, dependent on such a small group in such a limited area. Shadow himself was showing his age more noticeably. The silver in his hair had spread, and his movements were stiffer. He tired more easily than he had even a year earlier. At some point, probably not in the immediate future, but not terribly distant either, Shadow would die. What would happen to our relationship then? Would the others continue to trust me, or would my access to the valley end with Shadow's death? I didn't ask these questions aloud, but I think Shadow understood them anyway. He began making a point of including me in interactions with the other adults, ensuring they all had some individual relationship with me beyond just as endorsement. One warm afternoon in May, Shadow led me to a spot at the edge of the valley I hadn't seen before. It was a grove of old aspens, their bark marked with symbols in the writing system his people used. Shadow showed me that these marks were old, decades or maybe even centuries old, preserved in the slow-growing bark. These weren't just territorial markers. They were history. They recorded things that happened, births and deaths, notable events, warnings about dangers encountered. I was looking at a written historical record, a chronicle of his people's existence in this region going back generations. Shadow pointed out specific marks, and through gesture and vocalization told me their stories. Here was a symbol marking a terrible winter when many died. Here was a mark celebrating a successful hunt. Here was a warning about humans, dating from what must have been the early 20th century based on the growth patterns of the bark around it. His people had been here, in this general region, for a very long time. They'd watched humans arrive, watched human settlements expand, watched their own territory shrink year by year. They'd adapted, learned to hide, developed strategies for avoiding contact, but they'd persisted. Shadow made it clear that he was showing me this for a reason. He wanted me to understand that his people had history, legacy, continuity. They weren't just scattered survivors of a dying species. They were the inheritors of a culture that stretched back through time. The responsibility I felt toward them deepened in that moment. This wasn't just about protecting 5 individuals in a valley. It was about protecting a lineage, a heritage, a people who'd earned their right to exist through sheer persistence and will. As we stood among those marked aspens, Shadow did something he'd never done before. He handed me a piece of carved bone, worked smooth and inscribed with symbols. It was a record, a chronicle in their writing system, telling the story of his life, his birth in a different territory, his family's destruction by humans when he was young, his years of solitude and pain, his capture, his escape, his finding of this new family. It was all there, carved in symbols that I could now read with some difficulty. He was giving me his history, his story, trusting me to preserve it. I understood what he was asking. He wanted me to remember, to bear witness, to ensure that when he was gone, someone would know who he'd been, what he'd endured, how he'd survived and built something new from the ruins of his loss. It was the same thing I'd wanted to do with my written record, but now he was an active participant in that documentation. shaping how his story would be told. I took the carved bone and promised him I would keep it safe, that I would honor his history. The summer 2024 brought new challenges. Human activity in the mountains increased, more hikers, more campers, more incursions into what had been relatively isolated territory. Shadow and the family had to be even more cautious, restricting their movements, staying deep in the valley, avoiding areas where they might be seen. I worried constantly that someone would stumble upon them, that all of Shadow's careful trust building with me would be undone by a random hiker with a camera phone. In August, my worst fears almost came true. A group of backpackers set up camp less than 2 miles from the valley. They were planning to stay for a week, exploring the surrounding area. Shadow came to me at the trail marker in obvious distress. If the hikers wandered in the wrong direction, if they followed the stream, they could find the valley. The family couldn't relocate on short notice, not with the infant still so young and vulnerable. They needed the hikers to move on, or at least to stay away from a valley. I did something I swore I'd never do. I went to the backpackers' camp and lied. I told them I was a park ranger, that there had been a report of an aggressive bear in the area, that for their safety, they needed to move their camp to a different location. I showed them a map and directed them to a spot that was beautiful and safe, but nowhere near the valley. They grumbled but complied. I felt sick about the deception, but knew it was necessary. Shadow's family's safety outweighed my discomfort with lying. When I told Shadow what I'd done, he understood immediately. His response was to place his hand over his chest, then over mine, the heartbeat gesture. He was acknowledging that I'd put their safety first, that I'd risked human suspicion and potential consequences to protect them. It was another increment of trust, another piece of forgiveness given. I realized that our relationship had evolved into something I didn't quite have words for. It wasn't friendship exactly, the power imbalance, and history was too complicated for that. It was more like a covenant, a mutual commitment to each other's welfare despite the vast gulf of species and experience between us. Fall came, and with it my 62nd birthday, a milestone that made me acutely aware of my own mortality. I'd spent nearly 18 years of my life connected to Shadow's story, first through betrayal and guilt, then through the slow, painful process of redemption and rebuilt trust. I found myself thinking about what would happen when I died. Who would remember Shadow's people? Who would know to protect the valley? I had no children, no family I was close to. The record I'd kept was in my cabin. But what guarantee was there that anyone would find it, understand it, honor it? I talked to Shadow about this concern, using our shared communication system and drawings in the dirt. I explained that humans didn't live as long as I thought his people did, and that my time was probably more limited than his. I asked what would happen to our agreement, our relationship, when I was gone. Shadow listened carefully, then led me back to the aspen grove with the historical marks. He showed me again the symbol for memory, for remembering. Then he drew a new symbol in the soft earth, a representation of me, crude but recognizable. He drew it next to a representation of himself. He was telling me that I would be remembered in their history, that my story would be preserved in their oral and written traditions just as it had been in my record. The human who betrayed and then returned, who learned to earn trust again, who protected the valley. I would become part of their story, their mythology, a cautionary tale and a hopeful one at the same time. The thought that I would be remembered by these people, that my existence would have meaning in their historical narrative, moved me beyond words. But Shadow had more to show me. He led me to a different tree, a large cedar at the heart of the valley, and showed me fresh marks carved into its bark, symbols I could now read. They spelled out, in his people's writing, a promise that they would protect my memory as I had worked to protect theirs, that the covenant between us would extend beyond our individual lives. It was a binding commitment from their community to remember and honor our relationship. I traced the symbols with my fingers, feeling the wood grain beneath the marks, understanding that this was something sacred, something that transcended the individual. As winter approached again, I reflected on the impossible journey I'd been on, from the ambitious young scientist who thought she could control and contain a discovery through the depths of guilt and self-loathing, to this place where I'd been given a gift I never could have imagined, a place in another species' history, their tradition, their memory. Shadow had taught me that forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past or pretending the harm hadn't happened. It was about acknowledging the wound fully and then choosing to build something new despite it, perhaps even because of it. The last time I saw Shadow was in late November of 2024. Winter was coming on hard and early. and he'd indicated through messages left at the trail marker that the family would be hibernating through the worst of the cold, minimizing activity and living off stored resources. Our final meeting of the year was brief but profound. He brought Cricket and the infant, now old enough to take a few toddling steps, to see me. He wanted me to see how they'd grown, how the family was thriving despite all the challenges. Cricket had something for me, a carving they'd made, more sophisticated than the crude early attempts. It was a representation of a human figure and a figure of their people, standing side by side, hands touching. The youngster who'd been so sick just a year earlier had made art depicting our relationship, their understanding of the covenant between their family and me. I accepted it with shaking hands, understanding that this was a treasure beyond price. Shadow and I stood together one last time before the winter separation. He placed his hand over my chest, feeling my heartbeat, and I placed mine over his. The same rhythm, the same pulse of life, person to person, family to family, despite everything that divided us. He vocalized softly, a sound I'd learned meant until we meet again. Not goodbye, but a promise of return. I echoed it back to him, my voice rough with emotion. I watched them walk back into the valley, the large figure of Shadow moving with Cricket, and the mother carrying the infant. A family, a people, survivors who carried in their bodies and their traditions a history older than human civilization, who'd learned to persist in the shadows while the world changed around them. I played a role in their story, first as a threat, then as something else, something better, something that might even count as redemption. I'm writing this now in my cabin, as snow falls outside and the winter settles in. I'm 62 years old, and I don't know how many more winters I have left. The record I've kept, the full story of Shadow and his people, sits in a sealed box in my closet. Instructions are with my will that it should be delivered to a specific anthropologist I trust, but only after my death, and only with strict conditions about how the information can be used. The location of the valley will never be revealed. Shadow's people deserve their privacy, their autonomy, their right to exist on their own terms. When I die, I'll be remembered in two ways. In the human world. If I'm remembered at all, I'll be the scientist who threw away a promising career, who violated research ethics, who was blacklisted and disappeared into obscurity. But in a valley in the Montana mountains, in symbols carved into cedar bark and aspen wood, in the oral traditions of a people most humans will never know exist, I'll be remembered differently. I'll be the human who learned what it meant to truly see another person, who betrayed and was forgiven, who spent half her life trying to earn back trust that she'd shattered. Shadow gave me something I never expected and didn't deserve. The chance to be part of something larger than myself, larger than human civilization, larger than the scientific legacy I'd once craved. He taught me that being a person isn't about species or DNA percentages or cognitive tests. It's about recognition, about seeing the personhood in another being and honoring it. It's about forgiveness that transforms both the forgiven and the forgiver. It's about covenant and commitment that transcends individual lives and becomes part of a shared history. I betrayed Bigfoot to the federal government in 2007. What happened when he found me again 16 years later broke my heart open in ways I didn't know were possible and rebuilt it into something capable of understanding grace. This is my testimony, my witness, my small attempt to honor a debt I can never fully repay. Shadow and his people are out there, living their lives in carefully guarded secrecy, carrying forward a heritage that stretches back through millennia. They persist, they survive, they remember, and in their memory, I hope, my story will serve as a reminder that even the worst betrayals can sometimes, through tremendous effort and unearned grace, be transformed into something that looks like redemption. That's all any of us can really hope for, to be remembered not just for our failures, but for how we try to rise above them, to be seen, despite everything, as trying to be worthy of the trust we're given, to be, in the end, a person among persons, all of us carrying our wounds and our histories, all of us trying to build something beautiful from the fragments of our broken stories. That's what Shadow taught me. That's what I'll carry until my last breath. And that's what I hope, in some small way, these words will preserve long after I'm gone.